Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and also for inviting me to this seminar. I'm a big fan and it's a great pleasure to speak here. So as you already said, I'm talking about uncertainty-aware predictive processing, and let me start by saying what I actually mean by predictive processing. So predictive processing refers to the idea that our brain maintains an internal model of the outside world based on which it can make predictions about our sensory experiences. To predict those sensory experiences, they first need to be encoded in neural activity. So to be precise, the idea behind predictive processing is that higher level brain areas predict the activity of lower level sensory areas. And this may include several processing stages. So if the internal model is not perfect because, for example, the world recently changed, then this may result in a prediction error, which is sent back to the higher level area. And there are many examples that show that the brain does not only operate in a feed-forward manner, but that higher level information influences processing on a lower stage. And in the next slides, I will explain why predictive processing seems to underlie both perception and learning. So predictive processing seems to underlie perception, because when we perceive something, we rarely perceive what is actually there, but we perceive a combination of what we expect to see and what is there. And this is possible because we have this internal model of the world that I was talking about. So we integrate our prior beliefs or predictions from this model with the sensory information. And visual illusions very nicely show that this is the case. And here's an example. If you haven't seen it before, the image on the right looks like some random dots. However, once you've seen that there's a dimension, your knowledge will help you perceive the dimension every time you see that image in the future. And here's another example. In many perceptual tasks, we can observe something called the central tendency effect, which describes the phenomenon that the perception of a stimulus is biased towards the prior belief. And in this study by Petschner and Glasauer, subjects had to reproduce a distance by which they were displaced in a virtual reality setup. And here in this plot, you can see on the y-axis, the reproduced distance, on the x-axis, the actual stimuli. And you can see that the reproduced distance was biased towards the sample means of the actual stimuli. Already the classical predictive coding model, which was introduced by Rao and Ballard in 1999, can explain the central tendency, because it assumes that the current representation R, which can be thought of as representing what is perceived, depends on both the bottom-up sensory information and the top-down prediction, where the top-down prediction corresponds to the prior. And combining sensory information with priors is useful in a world which is highly variable and noisy, in which we cannot always rely on sensory information. So the question is how much weight we should give to priors relative to sensory information. And according to Bayesian inference, prior and sensory information should be weighted according to their uncertainties. And I will give you an example. Imagine you are in a dark room. Here, the sensory information is pretty unreliable. So if you know the room, you could use your memory, which basically gives you a prior, to navigate in it nevertheless. So in the dark, you weight your prior from your internal model of the room more strongly than the sensory information, because your sensory information is very uncertain. But if you are in a hotel room, which you do not know very well, so that means your prior is also uncertain, then you need to turn on the light to get reliable sensory information. And in that case, you rely more on your sensory information than on your prior. So we combine sensory information and prior expectations based on the uncertainties. And this corresponds to Bayes' optimal integration of priors and sensory information. And there's quite some behavioral evidence that humans are close to Bayes' optimal in this regard. So predictive processing is important for perception, but why is predictive processing also important for learning? So predictive processing is useful for learning because we can use the prediction errors that I was talking about earlier to update our internal model of the world, namely to generate a better prediction. So prediction errors should not be thought of as bad mistakes, but as useful learning signals. And in the predictive coding algorithm, learning corresponds to updating the weights, which happens only after we inferred the optimal representation. What about uncertainty in this case? So for learning, the predictive processing framework is more intuitive without uncertainty. Without uncertainty, it is pretty straightforward. We just learn until there's no prediction error left. However, in a variable world, this does not work, because when sensory inputs are not always the same, but are, for example, better described by a Gaussian distribution, then even if we already learned to predict the mean of the distribution, which is statistically the optimal prediction, so the best prediction we can make, then we would still make prediction errors due to that noise. So the challenge the brain faces is to distinguish meaningful prediction errors, which result from a change in the environment from prediction errors that are the result of noise. So if we know how uncertain our environment is, we can take that knowledge into account to know how reliable a prediction error is. To summarize, perception can be understood as Bayesian inference, where prior and sensory information are weighted based on their uncertainties. And when learning from prediction errors, we need to also take into account uncertainty, as it determines how much we should rely on prediction errors in an uncertain world. We can actually formally derive these principles with the normative approach by formulating an objective. And in the case of predictive processing, our objective is to find the prediction which maximizes the likelihood of observing the current sensory input given the prediction. So the cost or energy that we want to minimize is the negative log likelihood. And with gradient descent on the energy with respect to the current representation, we get the update for the current representation. This is our inference or perception step. The update depends on both the bottom-up prediction error, that is the error between the sensory information and the current representation, and also the top-down prediction error, that is the error between the current representation and the prediction. And as you can see, both errors are weighted depending on uncertainty. And with gradient descent on the energy with respect to the weights, we get the weight update. This is our learning step. Also, the weight update depends on the bottom-up prediction error, weighted depending on the uncertainty. So both the inference and learning rely on uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. However, this uncertainty is usually a fixed parameter in most models, like for example also in Rao and Ballard's model, and is not learned. So today we'll explore how uncertainty shapes both perception and learning. And first I will suggest that prediction error activity should be scaled according to uncertainty, which we call uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. And I will show how these could be computed in cortical circuits. And second, I will present a normative account of learning uncertainty or confidence and show how this could be learned with so-called second-order prediction errors. Let's start with the uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. So promisingly, a physiological basis for prediction errors can be found in identifiable circuits in the mouse brain. Prediction errors have been found actually in many different areas by different labs, and most of these studies are from the visual cortex and were done in Georg Keller's lab in Basel. So the cells that show prediction error activity are typically excitatory pyramidal cells in layer 2-3. And today I will give you an example of prediction error activity in a higher brain area, the posterior parietal cortex. So to cause a prediction error in the mouse, the lab of Shankar Sachitanandam, from which this example comes from, did the following experiment. So what they do is they first present a tone to the mouse and then they deflect the whiskers of the mouse. And they do this repeatedly, like 120 times, such that after a while, upon only hearing the tone, the mouse already has an expectation of the upcoming whisker stimulus. Now, to elicit a prediction error, they present a stimulus to the mouse that is different than expected. It's, for example, larger or smaller than expected. And then they look with calcium imaging into the activity of layer 2-3 pyramidal cells, and they see that there are neurons that become active when the stimulus is unexpected, but they do stay silent when everything happens as expected. So this gives us the perfect starting point to investigate prediction error computation and the role also of the different cell types in these circuits. And one particularly interesting question is, or at least for me interesting, would be how does uncertainty affect these prediction errors? As a theoretician, I like to start with a theory and ask, how should uncertainty modulate prediction errors? And actually, I already answered this question before by introducing predictive processing, but here I would like to derive it again for this particular example, also to have everybody on board. So let's assume the mouse has the following task. Given some sound A, the mouse has to make a prediction of the upcoming whisker intensity. Now, to introduce uncertainty, we make the whisker stimulus variable. And let's assume the intensities are drawn from a Gaussian distribution, such that the whisker intensities vary around a mean, mu with a standard deviation sigma. So Gaussians are always nice theoretically. That's why we use a Gaussian here. And now let's formalize this as an optimization problem. The mouse wants to make the best possible prediction mu hat star which is the prediction that maximizes the likelihood of observing the incoming whisker stimuli. Now, as I said before, the best prediction that the mouse can make is the mean of the distribution. So that is the best prediction in the Gaussian case. But the mouse does not know the mean. Instead, it has to infer the mean from the incoming whisker stimuli. Now, optimization theory tells us how with each stimulus, we can improve our current prediction to finally end up at the best prediction. And an iterative optimization algorithm, such as stochastic gradient descent, tells us that the update of the current prediction should be proportional to the difference between the current stimulus and the prediction, scaled by the inverse of the variance of the stimuli, which we call the uncertainty. So essentially by the uncertainty-modulated prediction error. So this means that when our stimulus distribution is very variable, our update to the prediction should be small. But if it's not so variable, the uncertainty is low, then we can make a larger step in our change in the prediction. So we can rely more on the prediction error. So the theory predicts uncertainty-modulated prediction errors, which I here call UPEs, because the word is very long. So do these layer 2-3 cells maybe compute such UPEs? And how would they do that? So first of all, I would like to note that these UPEs can be positive or negative, depending on whether the stimulus is larger or smaller than expected. But firing rates in cells are always positive. It has therefore been suggested that there are two populations of neurons for positive and negative errors. So I also split up our UPE into these positive and negative parts here. And for the talk, I would like to focus on the positive prediction error neurons and ask whether they can compute uncertainty-modulated positive prediction errors. To calculate the difference between the stimulus and the prediction, the neuron must have access to those inputs. And we are here now in posterior parietal cortex, which is the higher level brain area, and that receives inputs from both the auditory cortex, which could deliver the prediction, and also from the somatosensory cortex, which carries information about the actual whisker stimulus. So neurons in PPC, in principle, have access to the stimulus, and it could be an excitatory input to these cells. Now, the prediction should be subtracted, and there are somatostatin positive interneurons that provide such subtractive inhibition. Okay, so in V1, these interneurons have been implicated to play a role for surround suppression, where they deliver predictions from other receptive field locations. And then the activity of the cell should also be divisively modulated by uncertainty. And there is another kind of interneuron, the so-called parvalbumin positive cells, that provide such divisive inhibition. And therefore, we hypothesized that the SSTs could reflect the mean and the PVs could learn the uncertainty, such that in the end, the layer 2-3 neuron reflects the uncertainty-modulated prediction error. To test this hypothesis and to investigate whether inhibitory cell types in cortical circuits can actually locally learn to predict the mean and the variances of the inputs, we built a firing rate-based model with 3 different neuron populations. It's a rate-based model for now. So we tested whether it's possible to learn a weight A, to learn a weight W, which is here the colored connections in the figure, from a higher level representation of the sound A to the SST cell, such that the SST activity would reflect the mean of the stimulus distribution, given only the sound input. So what we do is we present the sound together with samples from the stimulus distribution, and adjust the weight according to a local activity-dependent plasticity rule, which is also known as the Obanchik and Zen rule. This is just a simple target-based rule that has been around for quite a while and also has been used in similar contexts by other people in the field. So then we can see that after learning, the SST rate reflects the mean of the distribution. And this works, of course, independent of the value of the mean. Now, the more interesting question that we investigated next is whether we can also learn a weight W from the sound representation onto the PVs, such that now the PVs reflect the variance of the distribution. And to compute the variance, just to remind you, here's the equation again, how to compute the variance, the mean has to be subtracted from the stimulus samples. And very interestingly, in these cortical circuits, PVs are usually inhibited by SSTs, which we before hypothesized to reflect the mean. So the PVs actually receive exactly the information they need to calculate the variance. So this time we presented 2 sounds to the model that were associated with 2 different variances to see whether the PVs can also predict the variance based on an auditory input A, So whether the weight W can be learned such that the PVs reflect the variance. So the variance will mostly be encoded in the weight, but the PVs should reflect the variance. And we use the same plasticity rule here. And in both cases, the PV rate reflects the variance of the stimulus distributions. Now, I'd like to give you a short intuition of why this works. So the PV rate is basically because of the inputs the PV receives from the stimulus and the subtraction of the mean from the SSTs. The PV firing rate is basically nudged by a mean subtracted stimulus. And although this is an unsupervised rule, this nudging provides a sort of variable target for the learning rule, and the expected value of the target is proportional to sigma. Now, we also have a quadratic activation function in the PVs such that the expected value of the PV firing rate in the end becomes proportional to the variance. So in the weight, we actually learn the standard deviation, and then with the quadratic activation function, the PV firing rate is proportional to the variance. So the model actually makes experimentally testable predictions for different cell types that we can test in experiments. So if, for example, the model learned the means and the variances of two different distributions with high and low uncertainty, which are shown here in purple and green respectively, and we elicit either a positive or a negative prediction error by presenting a larger or smaller mismatched stimulus, shown as black and gray bars in this plot, then we find that the SSTs in the positive prediction error circuit scale with the predicted mean, as we also hypothesized before. However, in the negative prediction error circuit, the SST scale with the stimulus. And I did not really introduce the negative prediction error circuits today. In those, the prediction is an excitatory input to the error neuron and the stimulus is subtracted. So it's just a mirrored circuit to the positive one. And hence, it makes sense that the SSTs also represent the stimulus in this circuit. In both positive and negative prediction error circuits, the PV activity represents the sensory uncertainty. And finally, the layer 2-3 parameter cells scale inversely with the uncertainty and hence implement uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. So what could these uncertainty-modulated prediction errors be useful for? Let's consider here a toy example where we want to learn the mean of the distribution in the activity of a representation neuron based on positive and negative UPEs. So the green neuron here in this figure is the representation neuron, which receives inputs from both these positive and negative prediction error circuits. And not surprisingly, we can learn this. So the activity of the representation neuron reflects the mean after learning, which you can see in the lower right plot. There is the rate as a function of the mean of the activity. But now let's look at the interesting part, namely the dynamics. How does the firing rate of the representation neuron change over time? And compare learning with uncertainty-modulated prediction errors with learning with simple prediction errors that are not modulated by uncertainty. So the golden line here represents a circuit with UPEs and the black line one with unmodulated errors. And when uncertainty is high, as in this plot, we can see that the circuit with UPEs learns more slowly than the control, such that fluctuations in firing rate are smaller and the mean representation is more stable. However, when uncertainty is low, as in this next plot, learning is faster with uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. So in a sense, the UPEs enable an adaptive learning rate that is adjusted based on how reliable the sensory information is. We were, of course, interested in whether UPEs can implement Bayes optimal weighting of priors and sensory inputs. And one hallmark of Bayes optimal weighting is the central tendency effect that I described already earlier in the talk, but I want to just repeat it again. This has been observed in many behavioral experiments, and it describes the phenomenon that perception of noisy stimuli is biased towards the mean of the observed stimuli, which basically serves as a prior. And we wanted to see whether we can achieve such an effect also with UPEs. Here we tested whether we can also achieve this Bayes optimal weighting of prior and sensory information with UPE circuits. Here we have again a representation neuron in green, which activity is updated based on bottom-up errors. That is the error between the current representation and the sensory input as before. And now also based on local errors. Those are errors between the representation and the prediction from the higher level. So this is essentially very similar to the Rao and Ballard architecture. And then we vary the sensory uncertainty while keeping the prior uncertainty fixed. And here we look at the activity, how much that resembles the sensory stimuli and the prior. So in these 3 different plots, we have different values of sensory uncertainty. And we see that the influence of the prior increases with increasing sensory uncertainty. So our line becomes flatter, which is in line with Bayes optimal integration. Now, when we vary the prior uncertainty, we find that the representation is less modulated by the prior, with increasing prior uncertainty, which is also in line with Bayes optimal integration. So to summarize this first part of the talk, I suggested that prediction errors used for learning should be modulated by uncertainty. I also demonstrated with the circuit model that different elements of cortical circuits can compute means, variances, and uncertainty-modulated prediction errors. And the model shows that UPEs reduce fluctuations in the representation and enable adaptive learning rates. And finally, we saw that UPEs can explain the central tendency effect. Next, I will present a project with Arnaud Granier, who is a brilliant PhD student in Walter Zen's lab, who will actually defend his thesis in 2 weeks. And in this work, we suggest that uncertainty or confidence about predictions are learned by computing so-called second-order prediction errors. In this project, we extend basically the predictive coding theory by the idea that the higher level does not only predict the mean representation on the lower level, but also its variance or uncertainty. But why should uncertainty be a function of higher level activity? So the brain is organized in a hierarchical manner where representations become more abstract along the hierarchy. And understanding the brain as such a generative or predictive machine, abstract higher level representations hence predict detailed lower level representations. And for example, a representation of a tropical forest predicts the presence of bananas, which again predicts the presence of the color yellow on a lower level. So it is conceivable that the variability of each feature somehow depends on this higher level category. If the higher level representation is a banana, for example, the prediction on the feature level is yellow. And because bananas are usually yellow, the higher level can be confident about its prediction. However, if the representation is an apple, it is less confident as apples can have very different colors. So since this variability of each feature depends on the higher level category, it makes sense that the higher level can also predict this variability. Here we again take an energy-based approach to derive the network dynamics. And here the energy defines the objective function the cortex should minimize. And this time, in contrast to classical predictive coding, it takes into account the uncertainty. So our objective is, on the one hand, of course, to minimize the prediction errors, and on the other hand, to maximize the confidence, where confidence is the inverse of the uncertainty. And note that because we apply a variance normalized norm to the errors also, the confidence also increases the influence of errors. But this is exactly what we want. That is similar to the uncertainty-modulated prediction error that we had before. So from this objective, we can derive the neuronal dynamics by taking the gradient of the energy with respect to the current representation U and multiplying it with our metric. And the neuronal dynamics then are leak term, the top-down prediction, and the errors, which are gain modulated by uncertainty from the higher level area. This actually resembles the membrane equation of a typical pyramidal neuron. Now, we have 2 errors here in the term AL. On the one hand, the classical bottom-up prediction errors that we've talked about before, and then also we have second-order errors, which are the error on the estimated variance on the lower level. You can see here that the classical errors are modulated by, on the one hand, the confidence for the lower level, as well as, on the other hand, the uncertainty on the higher level. So this leads to a dynamic balancing of cortical bottom-up and top-down streams, which I will illustrate in the following. So there will be a more intuitive example now. If the current representation predicts a feature which we learned is not variable, it has high confidence about its prediction. For example, if the higher level representation is a tree, then we can be confident to see features such as the trunk and branches, and therefore if we then make an error, that is, we don't see a trunk or branches, it is probably not a tree that we are seeing. So the error should be scaled up. If on the contrary, the confidence is low, for example, trees can have leaves in the summer but do not have leaves in the winter, then an error does not necessarily contradict that I'm seeing a tree. So it should have little influence on my representation of the tree. Now, how much the error matters should not only be influenced by the current representation, but also based on the higher level context. For example, in a forest, it is much more likely to see a tree. Therefore, we can rely more on the high level prediction, which means listening less to sensory errors. In a city, however, I'm less confident to see a tree, so it is better to listen to the sensory information, which is contained in the error. We can actually show that this dynamic balancing leads to base optimal weighting of cortical streams. And here you can see the orange bar, that is our model, which is on par with base optimal weighting, shown in green. And the other bars show models without any weighting or only using the mean precision or mean confidence. Now, in the last part of the talk, I would like to show the advantage of calculating errors on the uncertainty estimate and propagating them in the cortical hierarchy. So on the one hand, we learn to predict means, and on the other hand, we learn the confidence about the prediction. We then compare our confidence estimate with the errors we make to get our so-called second-order errors, which are also propagated in the cortical hierarchy, which means that they actually influence the higher level activity. So for learning the mean and the confidence, we derive the learning rules from the energy function like before, and they turn out to be simple Hebbian plasticity rules, which depend on the presynaptic activity and the postsynaptic error. And we can see also here that uncertainty down modulates the prediction error during learning, so we learn less from more variable inputs. The second order error propagation has an interesting functional advantage, namely that it allows nonlinear classification in a single area. And here's a simple illustration with the binary classification task. There are two output neurons here, in green and in blue, which indicate to which class each input belongs to, the green or the blue class. Each input here is a two-dimensional point sampled from one of the two class distributions shown on the right. We have here three different cases, which are all linearly non-separable that we look at. And without this second-order error propagation, the simple network fails to classify the points correctly, as the classes do not allow for a simple separation of the points by line. However, if we propagate the second-order errors back to the output neurons, they are able to classify the points correctly. To summarize the second part of the talk, we here formally derived neural dynamics that minimize prediction errors, and we suggest that cortical areas not only predict the activity, but also the confidence in their predictions. And the theory predicts the existence of cortical second-order error neurons, which we now can try to find experimentally. And why is this useful? So first, learning and using confidence leads to base optimal integration of bottom-up and top-down cortical streams. And second, propagating second-order errors enables nonlinear classification in a single area. Last but not least, I would like to mention Loreen Herteg's recent work, in which she demonstrates via a hierarchical circuit model that positive and negative prediction error circuits can also estimate both sensory and prediction uncertainty corresponding to input noise and environmental volatility, which can also be used to modulate the weighting of bottom-up versus top-down signals. And I can only recommend to check it out if you're interested in this line of work. So with this, I would like to thank Arno Grani, who did the work I presented in the second part of the talk, as well as my former advisors, Walter Senn and Mihai Petrovic, and the people in their labs at the University of Bern, as well as my collaborators, Loreen Herteg, Claudia Kluppa, and Shaka Sarinanadam, that I also mentioned during the talk. And I recently actually started a lab, as David already said, at the Institute of Neuroinformatics in Zurich. So let me know if you're interested to visit us. We are always happy to have visitors, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.